Good morning to all of you, and good morning to Professor Gowda. Professor Gowda represents a very unusual mix of talents. He was a professor at the Indian Institute of Management, a scholar who came into public life, came into politics, became a member of parliament. And this is really an unusual combination in modern democracies. It shouldn't be, but it is. Uh, Professor Gowda, we are here to talk about the triad of government, the private sector, and civil society, including large philanthropic organizations, both national and international. Uh, we are in the midst of a rather peculiar phenomenon in the developmental narrative where national identities have become stronger, sovereign national governments have gained strength, yet paradoxically, state capacities have withered in many countries. And the provision of what used to be considered public goods is now being shared with the private sector, with philanthropic organizations, with civil society. How do you explain this strange phenomenon?
First, Ashok, it's a tremendous pleasure to be here. And it's interesting, the theme of our panel. I actually teach a course called Business, Government, and Society. So there's so much to cover. Anyway, what you're pointing out too, the decline in state capacity, is a real challenge. To give you an anecdote, when I was a kid, I used to go to government hospitals. And over the decades, we've sort of moved on to the private sector. Now, when you think about why, it's partly because government institutions were overwhelmed by population growth, by better returns for doctors in the private sector, etc. So they were not able to necessarily retain the best talent that you could find. But what this has resulted in is actually worsening inequality. Those who can afford to are able to take advantage of the private sector options, or those that have been, especially in healthcare, the non-profit and even religious institutions all perform a very crucial role. So there, the role of government needs to be re-emphasized, right? Whether it's by harnessing technology or by anything else, you need to make sure that these fundamental welfare responsibilities of government, the public goods, health, education, infrastructure, etc., these are still very much the responsibility of governments. This is what the larger social compact is all about. We elect governments to provide that to us, some minimum level. And this is extremely important because we have such young populations, and if we don't rise to the occasion now, we'll be leaving large sections behind. And so it's imperative that governments find a way to revive state capacity. As I said, technology could be an amazing solution there.
So much of what you say is true for South Africa, for India, and large parts of the global South. Uh, Given this triad, these three institutions that sometimes converge, sometimes compete, what is the role of the government? Is it there to sort of balance the priorities of the private sector and civil society? How does the government harness the energies of the other two institutions towards the common objective of developmental goals? Right. Any examples from your life?
See, there's tremendous energy, as you put it, in the private sector, in the non-profit sector, and the profit motive is an amazing driving force. So the question is, how can you harness it for the good rather than the other way? Otherwise, right? If you think about what the private sector brings to the table, the pursuit of profit generates innovation, generates jobs, generates growth, generates revenues and taxes for governments, which can be utilized for infrastructure and many of the other welfare agendas. So if you think about what the role of government should be in this context, it is to, it's to unleash the positives. So for example, the private sector can be harnessed to generate more jobs and exports, like in Karnataka, in India for that matter. The whole information technology sector is one which put us on the global map. gave us a new sense of confidence in our capabilities and has, over time, generated a whole new brand image for the country and its engineers, and now has resulted in our people, our products becoming the heads of Amazon and Google and you name the Western multinational, Microsoft, etc. Right? These are all our people who come out of the Indian system. Now, at the same time, the private profit motive can also, induce companies to try and capture regulation, arm twist governments, do things for the short-term benefit of those individual corporations at the cost of the country, at the cost of the global environment, etc. So that's where you actually need very, very strong institutions, not just the government, but even civil society. You need activism to identify and counter any rapacious behavior. Also, you need a very active media. That's another crucial institution that we don't lump under civil society, but it's part of the other sets of institutions that exist, and which also has a very crucial role in, in keeping the checks and balances going. So if you get that balance, and that's always negotiated and renegotiated, but fundamentally, think about the private sector, what else can it bring to the table, right? Once in India, we opened up to the idea that private investment through public-private partnerships can also come in, right? We found that there was a whole new set of institutions, whether private corporations that could help us build infrastructure, or foreign funds, right? If you take a country like Japan, where they have to generate returns to keep their pension funds going, etc., they look for high growth economies to invest and to generate the returns to keep things going back home. And Japan is not a country with those kinds of returns. So this is where Africa, Latin America, the global south, India, which are faster growing economies, have, if we can put in place the institutional frameworks that can assure investors that, that their money is safely invested, that there are not too many leakages, and that the returns will be generated that they can repatriate back to their owners, then you'll be able to harness the private sector and global financial capital itself in ways that you may not have thought about. And a city like Bengaluru, where I come from, is also the startup capital, right? So that kind of energy that we have, the kind of innovative potential that we see unleashed, right? And that, backed by venture capital and other kinds of resources from the private sector, allows us to generate products and services that, again, reach everybody, right? If you think about the private sector in India, one of its major contributions in the telecom space is, they had brutal competition, but the end result is that data is so inexpensive that the digital divide that we used to worry about, where people won't have access to the internet, etc., that's not really a matter that's concerning us in a big way right now. There's still some digital divides. So I'm just giving you some examples of the ways in which the private sector can really help serve the needs of the people of India or the global south. Yeah.
When you, whether it's in the classroom or whether it's in the policy room, when you look at the different converging and competing roles of the private sector and of government, do you think the private sector is always sufficiently sensitive to government priorities to achieve greater gender inclusion, for instance? Because governments across the world do try and empower women who have not traditionally got the opportunities, unfortunately, that they should have got. Do you think the private sector is as sensitive?
The private sector sometimes takes time to catch up, right? I mean, diversity has tremendous value. It's not just a token initiative. It's about the different experiences and the different kinds of knowledge that people from diverse backgrounds, diverse genders bring to the table, right? But this is where governments can step up, right? If you think about what the government of India has done, it has, for example, mandated through SEBI, that's our stock market regulator, that every corporate board must have women members, right? And so that's one example of forcing the private sector to act. And then in the course of a decade or two, you'll have enough catch up and you won't even have to ask. That's the sort of trigger that has its own positive impacts. But if you think about, again, what the government did, right, in the UPA years, right, 2004 to 14, we introduced a mandate that there is a corporate social responsibility, that 2% of profits have to be plowed back into society, into the communities where corporations are located, etc. And why was that? Basically, we said those profits that are coming to you are not yours alone. You're also benefiting from everything else that the government has put in place, whether it is the institutions, whether it is the educational institutions, the infrastructure. There's a lot that you take for granted. And when you're doing well and flourishing, maybe it's time for you to give back 2%, and of course more if you want to, but 2% is what's mandated. And this has again opened up the corporate understanding of their own role in society, right? So you see a lot more engagement, and this has helped the nonprofit sector as well, which benefits from partnerships with industry. So this is all evolving, but again, in a way that I think there is still a crucial role for government to be ahead of the curve and to trigger action, which will not normally be taken voluntarily.
I'll ask you one more question before going to the audience for questions it might have. In the past decade or two, under various governments, India has seen a lot of transformation, especially in the digital sphere, which has become a force multiplier. In our response to COVID, we all had problems with COVID, but in our rapid immunization, and of course, Bangalore, as in a sense, the IT capital of India and of the world, has played a big role here. In your experience, given what we've achieved both nationally and in various state governments, what are the learnings India could offer its partners and friends in Africa, in South Africa specifically, and in the global South more generally? Any specific ideas?
Well, the first lesson that we draw from India is policy continuity, right? If you take 1991, where we introduced economic liberalization and unleashed the power of the market, in addition to the dominant role of the government that was there in the 3 decades prior to that, you actually think about since 1991 to 2023, we've had so many different governments were led by parties with very different ideologies, including communist parties, etc. Right? And but the underlying trajectory of a liberalized economy, free market forces, within a good regulatory framework, we have not touched that, right? That has continued to be there. So that policy continuity gives everyone else a chance to say, okay, this is a safer space to come in and invest, things like foreign direct investment, which is longer term, more patient capital, wants to have that assurance, right? So every country should think about that minimum level of policy continuity, that window that needs to be maintained. The other major lesson from India, which, if you think about post-1989, you also saw the Soviet bloc, dramatically changing. But what happened there? The resources ended up with oligarchs, right? Instead, when we liberalized the economy, we also made sure that we had institutions in place, right? Whether it's the stock market regulator, whether it is, you name the institution in each sector, we put in place institutions to ensure that there would be orderly growth. And the stock market regulator is an interesting example. Part of their responsibility is to nurture the market and help it grow and get more people to invest in it, etc. At the same time, they're policemen. They have to make sure that there are no scams, and so there's a certain amount of very active balancing of competing challenges that they have to do. So institutions, another framework, and that's where, again, an independent judiciary, which is active and quicker than certainly ours is, would be very helpful. A media that plays its role in checks and balances. All of those make for a huge difference. What other lessons can we learn? I would say, yeah, the extraordinary role for governments they have to believe that their role is to make sure that there's equality of opportunity. Today is India's Constitution Day, and that's one of the central missions of modern India, to provide equality of opportunity. And that, whether through affirmative action or quotas or publicly provided health, education, housing, whatever, right? That governmental commitment, that compact, needs to be there to reassure citizens that the system is on our side, that one health challenge is not going to push us back into poverty. So there's a lot that we have been conveying. If you take a look at what the current government in the center has been doing, they've been paying attention to providing cooking gas and drinking water in the home, right? Suddenly that frees up half the population towards more productive pursuits. Women no longer have to fetch water from far away, firewood from far away. They are now able to have a cleaner microenvironment and devote more time to anything that they pursue, including rearing their children well.
That has gender, health, environment, all three
And
impacts.
so that's a major central government initiative. So nothing is too small for the government to think about enhancing, changing the quality of life and the possibilities that are present for their people.
That's very well put. If I could add something here, as you do know, I spent some years in government, including during the COVID period. And what was very interesting was, through COVID, you had the political parties and politicians on social media arguing with each other. But governments run by those parties in New Delhi, the capital, and in the states, I could see they were actually cooperating very, very deeply, very seriously in what was obviously a national response. Some of it went wrong, but much of it went right as well. But there was a unity in policy chambers which was not visible outside. That's democracy for you.
Let me point out that the pandemic or climate change, these are the sorts of challenges that don't allow for traditional boundaries. We're all in it together, and we had to cooperate, and we did so successfully, thankfully.
Going back to your role in the state. Karnataka, like many parts of India, of course, Karnataka has a huge digital industrial story. But it's also your community, it's a community of farmers. Given climate change, given the stress on food security today, what can be done to make farming both more remunerative for the farmer and, frankly, alleviate food security concerns, which are so alive today?
Yeah, so these are real challenges. The farming side of me doesn't earn very much at all. It's all just, it's a heritage connection. I do have some agricultural land, but the point is, though, that urban growth in Karnataka, in India, is tremendous. And urban growth and urban income growth is actually widening the rural-urban divide. But there itself, as urban incomes are increasing, you see a change in demand. People are changing their tastes. They're willing to consume more dairy products, more meat, more high-quality fruits and vegetables. And where are those going to come from? From rural India. So just like the dairy cooperative sector, my late uncle was a pioneer of that, is the White Revolution. These are examples of organizational structures that enable the profits from this demand to go back to farmers, including landless people who happen to own a cow, right? Okay, so that's the kind of success that we've seen in the dairy sector. We need to replicate that in the horticultural space, and add value and better packaging, maybe organic certification, numerous dimensions that can generate more revenue for farmers at the farm gate. Yeah. So that's the real thing.
And here, of course, examples from India or the global south, from countries such as Africa as well, of smaller farmers banding together into a cooperative or into a small business, are perhaps more relevant to our part of the world than large industrial farms.
Absolutely. In fact, large industrial farms have their own environmental consequences. But this is where one of the other products that has emerged from a city like Bengaluru, digital public infrastructure. There were panels discussing that. If these can be harnessed to allow farmers and consumers to connect with one another, to geographic indications, all sorts of other unique angles that can be brought to bear, I think you'd change the nature of agriculture. But we lost Dr. Swaminathan recently, one of the fathers of the Green Revolution. He was lamenting that it's become a greed revolution, and we need to replace that with an evergreen revolution. So let's keep that in mind when we think about this theme. Yeah.
On that happy note, the hope for an evergreen revolution, thank you very much, Professor Gowda.